Hi, my name is Helen Leung, and I'm the chair of SFU's Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. And I want to welcome all of you to the 7th Rosemary Brown Memorial Symposium. Every year, we bring together distinguished speakers and community leaders to honor the late Rosemary Brown, whose important legacy in social justice and human rights work you will be hearing about throughout our event. We're honored today to be featuring a talk by Dr. June Francis, the recipient of this year's Rosemary Brown Award for Women, and a closing address by the Honorary Melanie Mark. Now, before we start, I would like to first acknowledge that I am privileged to be connecting in from my home in downtown Vancouver, which is on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I invite you to acknowledge and reflect on your relation to the land you're connecting from in the chat. Now, it's with great pleasure that I invite Elder Margaret George from the Swahaluk First Nation to share a blessing with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come to this very special event. I ask Great Spirit to just guide us this evening. It's been a very difficult time for us not being together as family, and just a very special blessing for this event. Great Spirit, thank you for bringing us together, and just guide each and every one of us, especially our families and our communities from which we come from, and our families for allowing us to do the work that we do. I ask Great Spirit to bless the young ones who witness what we do and what we say, and just a very special blessing on all the special guests who are present here today, all my relations. And thank you for inviting me to be with you for this event.
I want to thank Elder Margaret for her blessing and her encouraging message for these really difficult times. Now I would like to invite Dr. Jane Polkingham, Dean of SFU's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks very much, Helen. I'm delighted to be joining you all today from my home in Vancouver on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations near the Sanok. Thanks to Helen, I've already thanked you, but thank you again, and the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies for inviting me to be here today. I'm excited to be able to be part of this and attend the 7th annual symposium honoring the legacy of Rosemary Brown, a figure who continues to inspire and motivate our faculty, students, and community at large in their own research, advocacy, and the commitments to seeking social justice. Today, I'm here as a listener and a learner to take in the knowledge and experiences of today's guests, the Honorable Melanie Mark and Professor June Francis, that they bring to share with us about the work of building a more equitable world. Like many other public institutions today, the university is in a period of transition and change. When it comes to building diversity, equity, and inclusion, the university has much to learn from community advocates like Minister Mark and Dr. Francis. Today's event, which brings together scholars, students, service providers, and the public to foster learning and dialogue, and to present the Undergraduate Award in Social Justice and the Rosemary Brown Award for Women, is made possible by the generous support of the Rosemary Brown Memorial Conference Fund and the Rosemary Brown Undergraduate Award Fund. And so I encourage you to please consider donating to those funds to sustain this recognition event into the future. So I'm really looking forward to what I know will be engaging talks and discussion on current issues of diversity and ongoing inequalities, and most importantly, ways of creating positive change. So thank you again for inviting me, Helen, to be here, and I'll pass the microphone back to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Polkingham, for your very encouraging message. Before I introduce our event, I would want to first remind you all of our community guidelines, which you can see displayed on the screen. There will be a short Q&A following Dr. Francis' talk and also after Minister Mark's address. Now you can submit your questions using the Q&A function. You can see the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And you're also welcome and encouraged to use the chat function throughout the event, but please observe our community guidelines and be respectful citizens. Now, closed captioning is available if you click on the CC button at the bottom. I want to thank the amazing team from SFU Public Square who is helping us run the event, and they will help you on the chat if you run into any issues. So don't be shy. You can just type on something on the chat and someone will help you if you're having problems. Finally, there will be a draw for prizes that are generously provided by SFU's alumni office before we finish. So do stay to the very end and see if any of you get lucky. Now, for many of you, Rosemary Brown really needs no introduction, but I thought I'd give a short biographical sketch for those of you who may be younger and not as familiar. Born in Jamaica, Rosemary Brown came to Canada in 1951, and she graduated with a BA from McGill University and an MA from UBC. She served as an MLA on the BC legislature from 1972 to 1986, and was the first Black woman to be elected MLA, and also the first to run for a federal party leadership when she ran to be NDP leader in 1972. While in office, Rosemary was a fierce advocate against racism and sexism, and she helped to craft and pass numerous legislations to improve the lives of those from marginalized communities. Later in life, Rosemary traveled widely and was passionate in her international advocacy for women's rights in the global South. Needless to say, she's received many awards and recognition and distinctions for her exceptional public service, including the Order of Canada in 1996. Now, today's event honors our department's connection to Rosemary Brown, which goes back to 1987, when she was appointed to serve as the Ruth Wynn Woodward Endowed Chair in Women's Studies at SFU. We are really grateful to the Rosemary Brown Award Committee, which collaborates with us every year to honor this connection and to recognize those whose work continues Rosemary's legacy, which exemplifies the value of public service, equality, and compassion. In Rosemary's memory, her friends, family members, and comrades have generously made possible 2 annual awards, which recognize those who have shown the same passion and commitment as Rosemary and who have made impactful contributions to social change. So this afternoon, the first of these awards we're going to present is the Rosemary Brown Undergraduate Award in Social Justice, given annually to a GSWS student who has made outstanding contributions to issues of social justice. I now invite Dr. Tiffany Muller-Murdahl, our department's undergraduate program chair, to introduce the recipient of this year's student award. Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Helen. And it is my great pleasure to share with you this award to Anya Sass, who I have known since the fall of 2018. I've known her both as a student in courses that I've taught, and as an undergraduate chair, I've also had the pleasure of writing other nominations for her. So I just want to share with you her amazing diligence and commitment to social justice and democracy. She is a double major in GSWS and political science and is finishing this term. And she has shown a tremendous commitment to human rights, and particularly the rights of refugees. And that's been in evidence throughout her coursework at SFU and even before at Langara. In a course that she took with me in 2018, she wrote a very compelling policy review of the Safe Third Country Agreement. I'm sure she can't remember that, but I do. And she has extensively contributed to her local community, both in Surrey and now in Cape Town, South Africa. So while she was living in Surrey, she was worked with the Muslim Food Bank and the Immigrant Settlement Services of BC. And she worked tirelessly to effect change for refugees, individuals and families who were seeking resettlement. And now she is pursuing internships and co-op work through the Premier's International Scholarship. So she relocated to Cape Town, South Africa, where she worked for the Adonis Masati Project, a refugee and migrant serving organization in Cape Town. And I am tremendously honored to be able to present the Rosemary Brown Undergraduate Award in Social Justice to you, Anya, for all of your work. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much. So first off, it is a little bit late in the morning in South Africa, so I apologize, I'm a bit sleepy. But yes, I'm extremely honored to be receiving this award, particularly as it is the namesake award of Rosemary Brown, who is of course a brilliant and devoted advocate for marginalized communities. I'm also grateful to be recognized for my work towards promoting social justice, especially as it's something I'm incredibly passionate about and have devoted much of my time to. To me, social justice is about more than building equity. It's about advocacy, awareness, building communities, and also healing. And it is about actively dismantling ideas and structures that are oppressive or exclusionary and rebuilding them to better reflect the diversity of experiences and identities within communities. So I've tried to incorporate these ideals into my volunteer work over the last several years, where I've primarily worked to advocate, as Tiffany said, for immigrant and refugee rights. So I've been involved in 3 separate private refugee sponsorship groups in Canada, one for a family of 5, one for a gay refugee with chronic health issues who needed not just protection, but also adequate healthcare, and most recently for a queer refugee couple fleeing both widespread violence in their home country as well as persecution based on their sexuality. I've also volunteered in different capacities to teach English to newly arrived refugees and immigrants using my skills as a former English teacher. And most recently, I've been volunteering, as mentioned, in South Africa with 2 separate organizations providing advocacy work to refugees and asylum seekers. So South Africa is a particularly challenging environment for refugees and asylum seekers as they receive limited support from governments or private organizations and are often legally and socially marginalized due to factors such as xenophobia, poverty, and racism. So the volunteer work I'm doing now in South Africa aims to provide both immediate assistance and relief to these communities, as well as advocate for high-level changes within the law, the immigration system, and sociocultural attitudes and beliefs. And I've especially recognized the importance of this work over the course of the pandemic in particular, where NGOs have really had to step up to take the government to task and fill in the gaps. So for example, our team at the organization I'm currently volunteering at in South Africa was able to successfully challenge the government to include asylum seekers and refugees in the emergency response benefit scheme here after they were initially excluded. And as well, at the start of the pandemic, I was also tasked with overseeing a huge and rapid food relief effort to our clients, many of whom relied very heavily on the informal sector, and so were stripped of their ability to earn income because of the pandemic restrictions. So the impact of these initiatives has only made me more invested in the importance of social justice, as they've demonstrated the importance of small-scale actions as well as mutual aid in the community, and the need for both these sort of kinds of organizations and community members themselves to fill in the gaps where the government may be absent. So thanks to the generous funding from the Rosemary Brown Award, I've been able to continue with my volunteer work while also focusing on my studies during my last semester at SFU. And I'm very happy to announce I will be graduating in June. And I'm planning on going on to law school and to hopefully continue engaging in advocacy work for migrant and refugee communities. So I'm very thankful for the encouragement and education I've gained from my time at SFU. I've gained so much from my professors and courses here that has had a very direct impact on how I incorporate ideals of social justice into my personal, volunteer, academic, and professional pursuits. So thank you again for selecting me to win this award and giving me the opportunity to continue with the work that I have been doing.
Thank you so much, Anya. I'm so pleased you're able to join us from the other hemisphere even. We're so proud of you. It's really amazing to hear all the wonderful work that you're doing, and I know will continue to do. So many congratulations, well done, and I look forward to hearing about, life and achievement after your graduation. Now we're turning to the second award, and I would like to invite Patsy George, who is the Honorary Director of the Vancouver branch of the United Nations Association Canada and the chair of the Rosemary Brown Award for Women Committee, to tell us about the second award, the Rosemary Brown Award for Women, and also this year's recipient, Dr. June Francis.
Thank you, Helen. I am Patsy George, and I'm talking to you from downtown Vancouver, traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I do represent the Rosemary Brown Award for Women Committee, which consists of BC Association of Social Workers, BC Federation of Labor, Congress of Black Women Foundation, Society for Children and Youth of BC, United Nations Association Canada, Vancouver branch, and the University Women's Club of Vancouver. On behalf of all these organizations Rosemary was associated with, let me welcome you to this 17th annual event of the award in Rosemary's name. The award recognizes a woman or a women's organization in BC that promoted the values and ideals Rosemary championed. She was a distinguished social worker, author, media personality, an academic, an elected office holder, and above all, a feminist. Her quest for equality was directed in a variety of areas, such as the rights of children, women's rights, human rights, community development, international development, political activism, and social justice issues locally and globally. This year, we have chosen international development as a theme in selecting the recipient. Rosemary acted with a strong sense of social democratic ideals and constantly questioned the status quo and empowered others to make positive changes. She was an advocate for the marginalized and brought a voice, a vision, and an agenda for justice and equality for all. During her years as a politician, she was instrumental in ensuring funds for rape relief centers, transition houses, women's health collectives. Elimination of racism and sexism from textbooks and curricula in schools became a priority for her government thanks to her leadership. Rosemary had a strong commitment to international development and practiced that commitment through her work with the United Nations and many international NGOs that she supported. We at the United Nations Association in Canada, Vancouver, were privileged to have Rosemary as our honorary patron. She personally traveled to Africa and the Caribbean several times in order to increase the potential for social capital in those regions, and was able to connect Canadian women with women in the global South. As an avid advocate of international development, Rosemary spared no words in criticizing Canadian government for giving less and less for this important work. All of us who work for equality and justice can take pride in our association with Rosemary Brown and the legacies we have created in her name so that we can continue to celebrate other women and students who are passionate about peace and justice on an ongoing basis. Today, we are honoring such a woman on behalf of the 6 organizations that make up the Rosemary Brown Award for Women. I have the pleasure of introducing this year's recipient of Rosemary Brown Award for Women, Dr. June Francis. Dr. Francis is the director of the Institute for Diaspora Research and Engagement at Simon Fraser University, where she is an associate professor in the Beatty School of Business. She is the co-founder of the Co-Laboratorio project, which works to strengthen cross-sector collaboration, learning, and innovation for more inclusive, resilient solutions in resource sector governance, policies, and industry practices. As the co-chair of the Hogan's Alley Society Board, she leads an organization whose mission is to advance the social, political, economic, and cultural well-being of people of African descent through the delivery of housing, built spaces, and programming. Dr. Francis has extensive experience in the private sector as well as internationally with governments, industry, and civil society to advance diversity and inclusion in governance and economic opportunities across a wide range of formal and informal sectors. And an award-winning academic, she has worked in South America, the Caribbean, and Europe. Her writings focus on diversity, intercultural relations, leadership, and participatory engagement approaches with vulnerable and excluded groups. She holds a BSc from the University of the West Indies, MBA from Canada, PhD from the US, and an LLB from the UK. Dr. Francis is quoted in the local media frequently. Let me present to you the 2021 recipient of the Rosemary Brown Award for Women, Dr. June Francis, and invite her to give us her response. Congratulations, Dr. June Francis.
My goodness, I must say what a pleasure, what an absolute pleasure it is for me to receive this award. And I will get into that a little bit more about Rosemary. But I also want to say what a pleasure it is to receive the award from Dr. Patsy George, herself a renowned, known for her international work as well in social justice. So this is indeed a double pleasure at this moment. I also want to acknowledge all the organizations. I know there are 6 organizations who have come together. I want to acknowledge my own university, and I also wish to thank the UN Women in Canada for the beautiful flowers that you can see behind me. And as you can see, I'm also displaying the award. I want to thank the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations on whose land I'm currently giving my presentation from. I will share my screen with you, and I hope that's okay. And I want to share with you a visual to start with. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get going with the discussion that I'd like to talk to you today about. Let me just get this right and get this going. So why am I so absolutely ecstatic about this award? Obviously, given all of Rosemary's enormous contributions, to get an award in her name is the most humbling experience I've had. I must say that it's hard to even begin to talk about the contributions that Rosemary has made to the world, to Canada, and to my own native land, Jamaica. But I want to start by showing you a picture of how I knew Rosemary. You see, for a small group of women in Vancouver, Rosemary was known to us as one of our sisters in our Sisters with Book club. This was a group of women, and I want to start my talk here. It was a group of women. We met every month. We continue to meet. We would meet in each other's homes. We would compare our rice and peas, or as some people would like to say, or peas and rice, which is an ongoing debate that we still have to today. We read books from the Black diaspora. We were intellectual challenges to each other. Rosemary was one of the great debaters, as you can imagine. And Rosemary was one of our bosom friends. And to have seen her up close puts her in so much more regard than you could ever think. But I want to raise my celebration and share it with this group of women who also have been the enormous support as the Sisterhood Book Club to this day. And as last Sunday we met as we debated Barack Obama's book, we reminisced and realized that we had been meeting well over 20 years with each other. So that's the Rosemary I know and love. Today, I only have a short time, but I would like to share with you a few things. One of them is, I'd like to start by talking about my beginning. And I'd like to situate my beginning at the beginning of this talk, because I think what you will see at the end of this talk is that what I will say is that the forces that started, that were so instrumental in my own history, continues to be the forces of colonization, slavery, and genocide that has had a long arc that continues to beset the lives of women and children globally, as well as Black and racialized and indigenous communities all over the world. My work with Peru, I'll briefly share with you some of that work that I've done. It's just, again, a short time. I will share with you not only the problems we encountered, the issues related to women in Peru, but also some of the work that has been done in terms of reimagining and dismantling this work. And I want to acknowledge that much of this work in Peru that I'll share is with my colleague, Christina Henriksen. And I hope she's here as well listening. And then I would like to end the talk by returning locally, because what I'm trying to show is that the forces that started in my own childhood are the same forces that have impacted globally, and are the same forces that means that as we look around our society today, we see that poor countries continue to be neglected in terms only 2.2% of vaccines have gone into the arms of people from developing countries, from the low-income countries. And as we look at homelessness in our community today, it is part of the same logic that has created these problems. And as Afua Powell, I know, who has spoken to the women's studies recently, said, to understand the legacy of slavery, how this legacy of slavery is expressed today, we must comprehend the systems of power and oppression, as well as the agency of white supremacy that is premised on it. So I'm going to start there. And I must start by asking you to bringing up my own history, and I'd like to acknowledge today that any work that I have done comes from the long history before me, the history that started with the extermination of the Taino and the Arawak peoples in the country of my birth, Jamaica. But in front of you is my own family. I am the last child in what Jamaicans would call the wash belly of my family. My family's to the right, with the exception of one of my brothers. And I want to situate myself as the child of Ivy Francis. Here is a mother who did not have the education herself, but was a deeply religious woman committed to her Christian faith. And there are two things that my mother committed herself to the legacy of girls and women, including all people, but particularly to ensuring that her daughters had the freedom of education. The second was through her Christian faith to commit us to making a difference. She reminded us of the legacy we had inherited, and reminded us that as children who had inherited this legacy, we had an obligation to continue the legacy into the next year. I also want to pay a tribute to my father, a man who was the first, one of the first Black men to have achieved the status of a senior. He was chief sub-editor at the Daily Gleaner, one of the first Black men, but a man who spent most of his life in the fight to throw off the colonial legacy from Jamaica. You see, because the fight for freedom in my native country, Jamaica, started a long time ago, before our people left the shores of Africa, the fight that would continue in the Caribbean to ensure the freedom of of our people started there. And I want to pay tribute to this great woman of our history in Jamaica, the woman and the nanny of the Maroons. She was instrumental in saving hundreds of slaves. And what she managed to execute, very few people were able. She brought the British to their knees. And in fact, they had to negotiate 2 treaties to create a truce. And this is the legacy, the long arm of colonization, the long arm of slavery that continues to beset us to this day. But I want to acknowledge the fact as well that this logic, this colonial logic, that I wanted to start this talk on, because I think what I'd like to show is that the same logic that that colonized the world is the same logic that's creating this inequity, and it's the same logic that we need to dismantle if we're going to achieve freedom for women and girls and for people of color worldwide. Because this colonial logic, as exemplifying this picture of this man being carried by the 3 Africans, should bring you to tears at the indignity that Africans and people of color have had to experience so as to privilege the Europeans and those who came to take to rob these countries of their wealth and their people. So this logic we have fought against. And what I'd like to share with you is something about my own history in this moment. So as a Jamaican, I have to share with you how, as far as I was concerned, growing up I was born as a colonial subject, but very early in my life, we won independence from Britain. We thought we had won a prize. We thought the very long fight that people like my father fought for had finally been won, that long history of fighting for our freedom had finally been arrived at. And I remember this day, I was a tiny child. My father worked the paper that day, and he came home with the most joy that I had ever seen as he told us, and we had fireworks and the joy that we had finally, what we thought, broken the shackles of colonization, and we would be free. And that was shared across the world. This is Kwame Nkrumah as he celebrates in Tanzania, and we see people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. being part of this great liberation struggle. People like Jomo Kenyatta and others who were across this world fighting for this liberation. And we thought the great hope of independence and decolonization had arrived. It did not take more than a few years before we realized that this was not to be, that the victors would set the rules, that the victors had set up a system, that arm of colonization would not relinquish its hold so easily. And so what instead we were left with were trade rules and an international system that had tied us to perpetual servitude, that our economies were so tied to this colonial inequality, and that the judgment, the history and discourse of inequality would so overtake the world that we did not have a fighting chance. But we did not know that. We expected to be free. And I have in front of you an article that was recently written just in 2019 that asked the question, when the Jamaican fought against post-colonial fight against exploitation, the question was, can we reignite that fight? Because you see, we understood that these post-colonial states were inherently unequal. And this was our Prime Minister, Michael Manley at the time, who fought a non-aligned movement across the world, that despite the opposition of the United States and the third world and the majority, it forced the UN to reckon at the time with inequality. And we thought that would do it. Of course, we now know that this continues. And the sovereign, we recognized that the sovereignty of former colonies were going to be undermined by their economic dependence on former colonial power and the systems that had been put in place. So what replaced colonization, we now know, is neocolonialism, which entrenched patriarchy. It entrenched an ideology of whiteness and entitlement. It entrenched a discursive myth of progress, a myth that does not tell the truth, that says that the developed country and the rich country does not address the fact that the wealth, as Walter Rodney reminded us before he was assassinated for his ideas, that the development of Europe was because of the underdevelopment of Africa. And that this curse, that the myth of progress in the West, being at the hands of the West, that has erased and minimized the entire role of slavery, genocide, and colonization. So when we're asked to follow the trajectory of the West, the question we must ask ourselves for developing countries, are you suggesting that we follow slavery, genocide, and colonization? Because that was what has undergirded the inequalities that we see today. So we see a world beset with unfair rules, economic dispossession, global extraction, and the domination of political institutions. Now, I'd like to switch your mind in the short time I have to think about to the country of Peru. I've worked all over the world, but I'd like to share with you this work in Peru with women as an example of some of the work that I have been involved with, and some of the ways in which I've come to think about what needs to be done. So we know the problem. We know that we continue to be disenfranchised. We know great swaths of the world are unequal. And we know these systems have been put in place because of this history. Going to Peru, our work was in the mining sector. One of the sectors that has been instrumental in creating this inequality. Colonization, as you can see from the pictures that I'm presenting here from Belgium, King Leopold, much of this world much of what has happened to Africa has in fact come from the extraction of goods and the genocide that occurred in the rest of the world around the extraction of wealth and the slavery that accompanied that to ensure that the servitude was there to create wealth for others. So as we went into Peru over a 5-year period, we went into an environment that has had a deep colonial history, that has disenfranchised a range of Peruvians, particularly indigenous women and girls, particularly rural women, particularly Afro-Peruvians, who have not benefited at all from the extraction, but in fact faced the very opposite, faced an environment that's been polluted and where they have been robbed of their intellectual property, they've been robbed of their self-determination, and face extremely dire circumstances. And the systemic challenge of racism in Peru relates entirely to the extraction of the natural resources from Peru for the benefit of developed countries and companies from these countries. We see a country of social environmental conflict, of historic exclusion, of persistent inequalities. And some of the poorest regions in Peru are actually the mining regions where women experience extreme high levels of domestic violence at the hands of both local and people who are brought in. Women have lost access to to the clean drinking water, and yet they continue to bear the brunt of the work and the work's excesses that attends to this. So our work really was, and I want to bring attention to the fact that my own history, and I know that of Christina's as well, what we brought to this work was a deep understanding that this work was not just about the mining sector, but the work was about the fact that women embedded in a colonial environment. And so the question was, how do we decolonize and embed anti-racist approaches in a system so disenfranchised? And the first thing, of course, we understood was that when women who have been excluded and marginalized from making decisions about their own future are not included in their own destiny, that when they cannot bring their ingenuity and their worldview to protect themselves, their children, and by doing so, the rest of the world, when they're not brought into the center, we will forever continue to see the levels of conflict and strife and disengagement and disenfranchisement. So our work there, we call it Women in Their Own Voices, where we supported the gender inclusion and participation in the natural resource, particularly around its governance. The issue here is you've got to address power. Who has power in the system? Who makes a decision? Those are the people who have power. Who decides on decisions about mining? Those are the people with power. Who gets the benefit? Those are the people we need to address. So we set about working with women. And one of the first things I wanted to say was it's not about imposing, of course, our logic on women. When we got to Peru, these group of women you're seeing out to the left had already put together a strategy for how they wanted the extractive sector to work, how they wanted to participate, what they thought. And what was amazing, and is not amazing, it was amazing to other people, was when we listened to the aspirations these women had, and we understood the ingenuity and the thinking and the creativity that went into the thinking about the future of the industry, that it was absolutely essential that they held the torch and led the way. But of course, we understand that many of these women are disconnected from women of privilege. So one of the things that what we tried to do was to create solidarity with other women. So to the right, what you're seeing is bringing together women from across the sector. And what we did was work together to try to work to come up and reimagine. So the first thing we wanted to do is, how do we move away from this model of extraction, if at all we want to participate? And how do we transform the sector by reimagining its possibilities? And women led the way in much of this work. What we knew was absolutely essential in this work was that we needed to collaborate with others across the system, but women and their priorities and their views had to be centered in that work. If not, we know that those voices get silenced. So we convened a number of spaces. I must say that I have never had so much fun. I gotta tell you, when you're in a space with women working hard, there is something about the energy and the camaraderie and the sisterhood that just takes over. And so a lot of our work was working in terms of what they would typically call capacity building, but to use the same techniques that we use as business prof with senior executives to build strategy. We brought the same approaches to women here. They worked on these strategies with us. They imagined their futures with their children. And this was also amazing because we absolutely were able to include children in this process. And one of the things we recognized is that we needed to bring others in. And the systemic change, women did not create the problem. Indigenous women and Black women didn't create the problem. And so the people who need to dismantle it are the people who created it. And so we convened spaces centering again the voices to reimagine everything from technology. We implemented a structure of using cell phones, for example, to include women in decision making. We worked with all the agencies across Peru. We worked with mining companies. We worked with governments. We worked with the national government. We worked with the local government. We worked with the regional governments. We worked across the system to convene the spaces, but always centering the initiatives of these women. A few other things, and I'm short of time, so I'll not have time to go into all of this, but some of the ways in which women have been left out of the picture. For example, in tourism, as Peru was opening up a major area, very disjointed, women had historically played a major role in this part of Peru. Were very, very interested in ensuring that they were part of the solution to create a more sustainable tourism idea, one that brought back in their long tradition that was robbed of them, of their weaving, of the local plants, the local animal, fauna and flora. And so working again to ensure that their initiatives are not only supported, but their local initiatives are linked to global supply chains, to global forces that are, of course, constantly working against them. This is towards the last slide I'll share with you, but one of the ones that I'd really like to talk a little bit about. You see, one of the ways in which colonization robs us is that it robs us of the very things that we have as our own. It robs our intellectual property and then reappropriates that into companies owned abroad or by elites of the society. We know this in terms of the way the cotton industry in India was destroyed. We know this is a pattern of colonization, ensuring that no local industry survive and that all industrial and high value added activities gets transferred to either the elites in the society or abroad, or multinational companies. So there are these women to the right who are actually knitting from fibers that they have to buy from from a major company in Peru. You see the llamas and the vicuñas that you see in the middle. Those vicuñas run one of the most expensive fabrics in the entire world. And yet, what we find is that even though this is on traditional lands and in traditional and based on traditional weaving technique, the women do not have the machinery and the equipment. Why? Because all of that manufacturing is where the value added is come. And so, in fact, the women have to be involved with selling their sheared llama fibers to a company who then sells it back to them at great cost. And then they knit these incredible work, robbing them of a history of their own work. So one of the things we worked with is thinking about how to create linkages, again, addressing it from a systemic point of view. What is a systemic problem here, rooted in international systems of disenfranchisement? I just want to quickly end by saying the same forces that I saw in Peru, the same forces that started in Jamaica, are the same forces that operate in our own city. Hogan's Alley Society and the Hogan's Alley story, many of you know, and I don't have time to go in, but it is about the intentional displacement of the Black community as part of the same logic of disenfranchising and dispossessing Black and Brown people globally, and privileging others. It's part of the same colonial logic. And so the Black community in Vancouver, of course, was displaced to make way for a highway that would benefit the white suburban community. When we look in Vancouver, what do we also find? That Indigenous and Black people Indigenous people are 8 times, Black people are 3.7 times more overrepresented. Let me rephrase that. Indigenous people are about 40% of the homeless population. Black people are almost 4 times overrepresented based on their numbers. These are part of the same forces that end up with immigration to Canada and yet experiencing racism in this country that ends up with these kinds of outcomes. So one of the things we have been working on as well at the local level is to create a place of welcoming to address the systemic imbalance. And as Hogan's Alley Society, working to establish this place called the Nora Hendricks Place, a place, the first of its kind, as far as I know, that privileges Black and Indigenous people and to create a racially inclusive environment for them. And this was the opening of Nora Hendricks Place. Now, I wanted in this short talk to talk about the long arm of genocide, slavery, and colonization. And then the incredible need we still have to dismantle these structures that have ended up with a legacy that we see globally, but we also see it locally. And the need for us to work across the system, because these are systems change. And we cannot rely on the people who have been disenfranchised to be the solution. It is our jobs to work to dismantle and reimagine these for more equitable places for women and girls. Thank you very much. Sorry, I meant
Thank you, Jim, for such a powerful and amazing presentation. I mean, the way you kind of weave together global and local connections is just wonderful. We already have quite a few questions from the audience, but I thought I'd maybe start with one of my own. I read an article, I think that you wrote a short time ago, where you were offering a critique of the way COVID data is being collected in Canada. And I thought it's just such a timely topic. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more around that research and that critique.
So the critique, of course, is that as we look at the ways in which most of our government programs are set up, including the public service announcement, we know that there is something in mind in the public sector, the public health, and it's a white normative approach. It assumes certain things, that you have a house, you work in certain jobs, you have access to space, you have certain kinds of privilege. So even before we saw the data from the United States, we started to ask the government to collect disaggregated data. This is part of a UN request that has been made. It has been a request of ours because of course, what has happened in Canada is without collecting data, we can pretend we're colorblind, and so we don't see, right? But I always say we're just blind to the inequities. So in fact, in COVID-19, we were asking for this data so that we could target our different communities with the support that would be needed to protect their lives and to help them to build back better. We have never gotten it from our British Columbian government. There's been some effort in Ontario, but we continue to be disenfranchised because the government cannot know the facts.
Thank you. And that could be, you know, an important fight that, you know, even people in our audience, that could be something that we ask for and fight for.
Absolutely essential. Yeah, because without knowing,
right,
we remain invisible, and the government can be invisible to the problem. Yeah,
the importance of data, right? Yeah. So from our audience, from Joanne Curry, the question is, what gives you hope for the future?
I love Joanne. Joanne, so good to see you. Not see you, but hear you. What gives me hope is the history. You see, I have to remember that those people who crossed the Atlantic and ended up in Jamaica did not give up hope. They fought every single day so that I could be here. They fought through generation. They fought to keep me alive. I'm delivered here because my mother fought, because my father fought, because people have fought for me. And so I have hope that as I continue this fight, that this arc will bend towards equality.
Beautiful. Here's a comment, or maybe a kind of comment from Tracy, who says, Dr. Francis, my area of concern is regarding inclusivity of the elderly in gender diversity and inclusion and gender-based issue that includes social justice. The cycle continues and we can learn from elderly women. So yeah, maybe I guess it's asking you to comment on that around elderly.
I love that. All my heroes are elderly women. You can see Rosemary was a generation older, but she provided so much guidance for us. And I hope we can become the elders. I also recognize it's more than just learning from elders, it's caring for them. One of the things that is challenging in a society like Canada is that intergenerational connections have been broken, that we build societies that do not seem to recognize that that people would like to live with each other, would like to share with each other. So we build houses that are zoned in certain ways. We build institutions that segregate us. And I think this is a fundamental problem, and the one that actually Hogan's Alley Society is very committed to. The idea of pulling back towards something much more inclusive, especially for elderly women and elderly people.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. It's related to another question from Doug Hamilton Evans, who asked if you could speak about the Hogan Alley Society and how it fits into the continuum of the work that you've described. So I guess asking about the relation to your other work. Yeah.
So the logic, okay, of why we as Black people have continued to experience Canada and disenfranchised in terms of employment, housing, economic opportunity, health, all the measures, in fact, show that Indigenous and Black people fare the worst in Canadian society. And we have that data, so let's not re-litigate that. And this is where Hogan's Alley Society fits in, because we recognize that logic is what has created the displacement of the Black community, because the Black community was a thriving community here in Vancouver. And like many Black communities across the country and across the continent, we were always seen as a threat. And what happened, of course, is that we were the first to be seen as a blight. We needed to be displaced. We were always characterized as pathological. And it was part of the logic here that displaced the Black community. And here's the last thing I'm going to say, because I can see there are more questions. when we displace a community, we displace the support, we take away the economic opportunities, we take away the political connection, we fragment people, and we then, and so there is a deep redress there is a deep redress that needs to happen to recover what was lost. And that's what we fight for.
Thank you. There's a question from Kim Allison Fraser, who asks, what small steps can women take as individuals to help dismantle systemic oppression when faced with everyday microaggressions? So it's a good practical question.
Yeah. So, of course, we know that the systemic problem is important, and that's what's creating the microaggression on a daily basis. You know, I must tell you that when I face microaggressions on a daily basis, it's deeply wounding, okay? I was recently in a pharmacy and had somebody follow me, and it ruined my week, okay? Because I am hurt each and every time somebody does something as a microaggression. So depending on who you are, if you're the victim of it, let's put that to one side. But if you are a bystander, if you see something, if you see systems that privilege you but exclude others, you have a responsibility. And in fact, you have an enormous opportunity. You have an opportunity to step in and to create space for others. So if you see something, do not turn away. To my fellow victims, let's say, who experience it, the way I survive these, of course, is through the strength of community. It's through sharing with others who experience these and other things like it. And I'm also, quite, I am a Christian, so I have a faith that I rely on. And this gives me the kind of courage to go back out there. And I must say, I said to a friend recently, the only good thing about COVID is that I experience less microaggressions. I can hide and nobody says anything silly to me, and I can have a good day.
Thank you. Here's another question related to your work on transnational mining companies from Paula Adiles, who said, thank you, Dr. Francis, for your incredible work. How can we raise awareness and put pressure on how Canadian governments support transnational mining companies in the global South, places where human rights and gender-based violence are commonplace?
Yeah. So I think let me start by saying, even though this isn't mining, I wasn't able to follow the news today, but I do hope everybody has put pressure on the Canadian government to support the US government in lifting the intellectual property barriers to COVID-19. So let's just make sure everybody out there is doing so at this moment and putting pressure worldwide. But I think that there's something as a business prof, I will say, you do have power. You have power as a consumer. So the choices you make, and making those choices, whether you're buying individual goods or buying shares or buying services, I'm just saying that you collectively, that is one way to shift dramatically. You can get the attention of these companies through the kinds of decisions you make on a daily basis. But of course, we have to also continue to advocate in all the spaces we're in, depending on the spaces you're in.
Just like a couple more questions. And I'm really pleased to see that some of the questions are really practical, people really wanting to take action. So from Ruby Campbell, how can people help you with your important work? Specific examples would be appreciated. And thank you for your leadership.
So lots of ways. So Whole Disaster Society is always looking for volunteers or for partners or for others to be involved. I myself, you know, a lot of the work that I do, I'm always interested in creating alliances and partnership with others who are doing similar work. I also think that as we go forward and there are fora and various places that we meet, it would be important to recognize each other so that we can create communities of practice together.
So last two questions. This one is from Mariella. Dr. Francis, you mentioned Jamaica often. Do you think your comments also apply to other islands of the Caribbean, to the best of your knowledge?
So I knew that I was going to step on every other Caribbean country's feet. And so I'm so glad, because the peas and rice country, because Jamaica is a rice and peas country, the peas and rice countries. Okay, so in our book club, this is Mariella from our book club. And this has been one of our greatest debates. And that is that Jamaicans have this incredible arrogance. And we're always, you know, the world thinks the Caribbean is Jamaica. Mariella, you have lived in Jamaica. You know how wonderful we are. But of course, not to be facetious, this, I hope, when I mentioned Jamaica, I was hoping to draw a parallel not only to the Caribbean, but to the Black diaspora, because I think it's the same logic.
And before I ask the last question, there's a shout out from Ellen Woodsworth, who says, June, will you please run for elected office again? We need women like you at all levels of government. So, so this last question I think is good to end on. As Jay Ahmed asked, diversity and inclusion is complex, and there are such polarized views and serious divides even within a community. How can we try and find common ground and truly move towards equality?
Yeah, that's, I think, you know, there are probably three things you need to do to make it as simple as possible. One is to acknowledge the inequalities. Many of the time we don't get started because I know that I have spent most of my adult life trying to convince people about these inequalities. And so if we don't acknowledge a problem and understand it and study it, we will never get past it. So I think the time has come for all of us to understand who has been privileged and who has been disadvantaged, and to self-study if you need. But the point is, the data is there, the evidence is here, the history is there. As one person said, is 400 years long enough for you to get this? So let's just at least acknowledge. Now, once we acknowledge this, obviously we don't stay there. We need to elevate it as a priority in all spaces, for the government, for industry, for the university, in my university in particular. We teach Eurocentric ideas. That's what we do. And every now and again, we have some special interest, something over there. But this is not history. This is not history. This is white history, okay? This is colonial history. So let's acknowledge these things, and let's elevate you know, give a priority, ensure that we all are committed to resourcing and to change. And to finally, we actually need to dismantle and reimagine. We really do. What does an anti-racist university really look like in terms of scholarship and students and what the world looks like? We need to reimagine international treaties. We need to advocate for the UN Decade of People of African Descent, that it really means something, that UNDRIP really means something. We've got to recognize that the system has to change. And then I think we can together, of course, move towards a truly multiracial, pluralistic, whatever you want to call it, society. And I'm going to end on this because I want to say this. When the sleeping car porters, who were the Black men who could get no other jobs, but were disenfranchised by being put on these, at the lowest rung of society to help open up Canada on the railway, took a delegation to Ottawa. They said to Ottawa, look, we want you to know there are models of multiracial societies. Look to the Caribbean. Look to the Caribbean. We are multiracial societies that work. we are multiracial. So we have something that we bring. We bring the understanding of what this looks like, maybe getting out of the way and getting off our necks and truly accepting the ingenuity and thinking that we bring would be a great place to go towards emulating some of those principles that we could share.
Wonderful. That's a great way to end. I want to really thank Dr. June Francis for a really wonderful talk and conversation. So thank you so much. Now we move into the last segment of our event.
Thank you for everybody, by the way, for being here. Sorry.
Thank you so much, June. Now we move into the last segment of our event, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Melanie Mark and welcome her back to SFU, where she graduated with a BA in Political Science. Minister Mark of the Nisga'a, Gishan, Cree, and Ojibwe First Nations is the first Indigenous women member of the Legislative Assembly in British Columbia's history. She was elected in 2016 to represent the riding of Vancouver Mount Pleasant, and she was appointed Minister of Advanced Education, Skills and Training during the 41st Parliament and is currently our Minister of Tourism, Arts, Culture and Sport. Her work has focused on social, environmental and economic justice, including creating free access to adult basic education and supporting Indigenous teachers and language fluency. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Minister Melanie Mark.
Good evening, everyone. Simgaget, Sigidamanak, Gibit Wiltsuk. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this really auspicious occasion. I just got the tail end of hearing Dr. June Francis and always inspired by her leadership. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. Being in cabinet, things happen quickly. And so thanks for letting me be the tail end of your agenda. This is something I really have looked forward to. It's the first time I'm actually giving an address from my kitchen table in my workspace. So just want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh and the organizers for hosting this event, Dr. Jane Pucklingham and Dr. Helen Hoxie Leung and Elder Margaret George, who I haven't seen in a very long time, Dr. June Francis, Chair Patsy George, and I recognize that Cleta Brown is joining us this evening. I hope that's correct. I don't have a lot of time because my time got cut into our agenda, but I guess what I wanted to contribute to this dialogue is to really acknowledge, Rosemary's leadership. And, when I look to the biography of becoming the first MLA, and I'll show you my pin. When you become an MLA, you get a gold pin. I became the 101st woman to get elected in 2016. And when I think of Rosemary in 1972, just before I was born, to become the first, what a testament to what that leadership entails, the endurance and the determination and the values and all of the things that help people to get to that place of representation, which I think is something I'm very, very passionate about. But then also to acknowledge her campaign in 1975, the year that I was born, Brown is Beautiful, and how courageous it would have been to have a campaign like that at that time. And so before maybe I continue with my remarks, I think it's really important to acknowledge where we come from. My grandparents are Nisga'a, Gitxsan, Cree, Ojibwe, French, and Scottish. They attended St. Michael's, Brandon, and Elk Lake residential schools, and my grandfather hid from Indian agents. And so in my lifetime, I have experienced the issues that we are discussing this evening around inequality and rights violations and displacement and all of the things that eat away at the core of who we are. And for Indigenous people, in many ways, that has been our language and our sense of pride and our sense of identity and our sense of belonging and our values that were mentioned in my biography around a commitment to social, environmental, and economic justice. So those are my parents, those are my grandparents. I grew up in East Van with a single mom in the projects of East Vancouver and Skeena projects. I've had a chance to move 30 times in my life and to witness firsthand the impacts of drug addiction and how that can pull families apart, and really started to understand trauma and understand the impacts of residential school. Things that I did not learn in school, in those colonial institutions that Dr. Francis talked about. And I really feel robbed by that. And so one of the values I want to share with you is passion for justice, and to turn things around, to write a new chapter for generations to come. And when I honor someone like Margaret and think about what Margaret may have seen in her life, and what my grandparents have seen in their life, and to share with you what I've been able to see in my life. I know that Ellen is in the room, and Ellen taught me that you lift as you climb. That is a very important value that has resonated with me as an elected official, representing the riding of Vancouver Mount Pleasant, where Hogan's Alley is, and there's a lot of things that are going on in Vancouver Mount Pleasant. But I felt like it was important to share where I come from, and my culture, and understanding that you know, we don't all come from privilege. We're not all groomed to be leaders. We're in my remarks that I gave at the First Nations Leadership Gathering, I had explained that many of us are groomed for poverty, and we're groomed to fail. And we are hardwired to believe that we are worthless. As we think about the Missing Women and Awareness Day yesterday, knowing that Indigenous women are more likely to be murdered. These are calls to justice that are very close to my heart. They are hard systemic issues to fight in one lifetime. So I'm going to talk a little bit towards the end about the importance of paddling together and a united front in our efforts to make change. So I got into politics after working 10 years with Mary Ellen Trapel-Lafond and advocating for kids in care, and you know, fighting one case at a time, trying to make life better for youth, and really felt like I wasn't going anywhere, and really grew angry about you know, who are the decision makers that are making these decisions for kids, and started to really understand, even though I have a degree in political science, I didn't really fully understand the political process of how people get elected and how they get to have a seat in the legislature. And as I started doing some work, realized that there had never been a First Nations woman to get elected in BC. And that was a rights violation that really motivated me, not just for myself, but the idea of representation, and that we have such a long history of violating and ignoring just the presence of Indigenous people in this province and what they contribute. And so I put my name in the hat, and some of you have had a chance to meet over the years, and it's been one of the best journeys of my life. It's not an easy place to be, and that's why I really think about Rosemary Brown and how challenging it is to be the first, and sometimes the only person at the table, and representing on your shoulders sometimes you know, issues that, as Dr. Francis mentioned, that are 400 years old, and that people are really calling on you to try to fix and address. And so shifting forward, I had the pleasure of being in opposition for 1 year, and then got into government in 2017, and having a chance to be the Minister for Advanced Education really gave me an opportunity to push the envelope for public policy. One of the proudest things that I've been able to accomplish was opening those doors for kids in care. At the last time I heard, 1,400 young people are going to colleges and universities in this province, because our government sees that if you invest in people and if you give them a chance, they can do amazing things. And I learned a lot of that through mentorship from people like Mary Ellen, to set your sight on the possibility of what can happen. And thinking about work that I was able to do even at SFU. I wasn't able to enjoy the cultural center that's going to happen at SFU sooner than later. I really needed that place of belonging, because it was pretty lonely in university, being, you know, the only one at the table, often talking about Indigenous rights and title, and hearing that sentiment that, you know, when are the Indians going to just get over it? How long do we have to hear about residential school? And as an elected official, I'm going to keep honoring my grandparents until there's change, and raising awareness, as Dr. Francis shared, that we have to acknowledge where we've come from in order to set our sights on what needs to change. And there's a lot of systemic issues that need to change. So I'm with you in spirit around the fight for inequality and how to address that. Education is often that great equalizer. Graduating from high school, I was the first in my family to graduate from high school and go to college and university. And in lots of ways, as a bit of a oppositional defiant person, I did it because people like me weren't typically welcome in places like that. And to disrupt the status quo is something that really inspires me. Not making people uncomfortable for the sake of it, but for them to understand that representation is important. If you have that diversity in the room, it changes up the narrative. And that's what I'm trying to accomplish as an elected official in the BC legislature. Another proud moment was bringing in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into the Legislative Assembly not too long ago. And so it's at this time, because I know that I don't have much more time, I guess I just want to share with people that change is possible. If you have allies and mentors and people paddling with you, and if you're paddling in the same direction together for the same reason and same passion. For me, my motivation is my daughters, and I believe I believe in my heart that we have a right to live a life free of violence. I believe that we have a right to not live in poverty. I believe that we have a right to have our rights upheld. And that's what I try to bring to the table as an elected official. Even in tourism, arts and culture, which is my new portfolio, you know, sports for some people is the great equalizer. If it weren't for playing rugby, I don't think I would have finished high school. I didn't really have anyone that said anything nice about me in high school, but I knew how to play rugby, and that gave me the confidence to cross the finish line. So I will leave with the sentiment of lift as you climb, and to paddle together, and to not ever lose sight of who you are and where you come from. I'm proud to be Niska, but when I think about what my grandparents experienced in their lifetime, that wasn't always the privilege that we carry. And we obviously have a lot more work to do, and we do that by having these gatherings. So I know I've gone over a couple of minutes over time, but tried to cram in as much as I could in this dialogue together, and just want to thank you. So Tuxism.
Thank you, Minister Market. It's just so inspiring to hear you, and I think you probably have now inspired some, you know, young women to go into politics and make a difference.
Go into politics. We're gonna elect June, and congratulations, June. I'm so proud of you. I'm sorry for interrupting, Helen, but
no, please go ahead. It's just a conversation. I love it. We just have a short time.
Thank you, Melanie. I remember you were at the opening of Nora Hendricks' place, and I meant to sort of bring that up, but didn't. But oh boy, listening to you again. Thank you so much, Melanie.
I think, June, your campaign starts here today.
I'll campaign for you.
Well, so we just have time for a couple of questions that are coming up, people really wanting to engage with you. From Lynn Warburton, who wants to ask, what's your approach, Minister? How do you break barriers that you encounter in kind of colonial approaches?
So I'll say that for those of us in leadership and the dialogues and exchanges that we have, sometimes the easiest thing to do is keep our mouth shut. And I don't have that problem. I actually have the opposite problem of I have a big mouth and I speak up because I think it's important to speak up. I think people are relying on us to speak up, and knowing that there's a time and a place. You know, in my earlier days, I probably may have spoke up more, and over time I've been measured in how and when to speak up. But I think it's important to have courage, and it's easy to say that, but courage doesn't come easy. We're not all born with courage. So that faith part, that value, my Niska name's Lahaikweskak, which means eagle that passes on to the next generation. And one elder said that they think my Niska name is more honesty. You know, be honest. If you speak the truth to power, then you can't go wrong. And just to know that you're not alone, and when you're speaking up, because people are relying on you, whatever that cause is that you're raising, I think is important. And for me, I always say, this isn't about me. This is about people. You know, I'll give you an example, gentrification, people that speak poorly about, oh, we don't want this, we don't want that. And I said, when was the last time you slept in a bench? So don't talk to me about, you know, whatever the issue is, unless you've slept in a bench, then you don't know what it means to be homeless. And we have to do more to help people that are marginal. And also, you can't be a voice for everyone. You have to pick and choose your battles. I'm going to be a voice for people that have less power, which often is in the case is kids. Kids are, they rely on adults to be their advocates. So that's.
Thank you. That is such great advice. Another question, very heartfelt question from Jessica Jimmo, who wants to thank you for being with us today. That is such a pleasure to hear you speak. And they're wondering if you have advice for allies who sit next to our fellow students who are the only one at the table to represent an equity-seeking group. How to support allies against the power of those who, you know, don't have the same investment. They feel that it's been really exhausting. And, you know, would you have some advice for that?
Oh yeah, trust me. I mean, all the gray hair I have, it's exhausting. Fighting colonialism is exhausting, right? That's why the paddle together and having allies, anyone that's interested to fight the cause with you. And I think relationship is really, really important. Someone once said to me, and when I talk about reconciliation, to me, reconciliation isn't for Indigenous people, it's for all of us. The principles are the same. But I think the idea that it's not a destination, it's a journey. And those relationships that I've cultivated over the years is like shared values, text each other, lean on each other. I have people that text me and I'm like, ah, you know, and I respond. People say, why do you respond to that person? It's just a young person or whatever. And I said, I don't care, make time. So I think you find your allies. Personally, when I went to SFU, I was raising a single daughter and I didn't have time to do political activism and all the rest of it. Again, that's the thing around privilege, right? People are hustling, working 2 jobs, raising families.
Thank you. And I just want to conclude with a shout out from Catherine Murray, who wanted to tell you these are such wonderful remarks from the heart. And she talked about that you have your oppositional defiant energy that is shared with Rosemary and June. And she said, we all need more of it. So we're all learning from you and June and Rosemary. So thank you so much, Minister Mark. I know you've had a really intense schedule, so we're really grateful for you to take your time out from this busy schedule and be with us tonight. It's just been wonderful and a real privilege.
It's my pleasure. I just want to say one thing that I meant to say, and that is, for those of us that were the first, and many of you are going to be the first in your family to do whatever it is that you set your sights on, to just, you're not the last, right? I'm going to stop when I'm not the only one. So that we kind of keep that principle of making sure that we empower. That's the pressure of being the only one. And that's what, you know, when I think about Rosemary, about how isolating that is, and to keep that into check as we move forward. So I'm happy to take a couple of questions, but I know you guys have to go. It's up to you. Dinner's in the oven.
Dinner's in the oven. Are they so generous of the minister? So if you have more questions, please send them on. Let me look. Maybe I'll ask you one last question, just from being a professor and knowing how difficult it is for university as an institution to do equity work. And I know you served as our, you know, in the previous parliament, you were the Minister of Advanced Education. Do you have any advice for administrators, especially in university, what are the most important things that they can do to kind of support equity work?
I think I caught the tail end of it. I'm not sure exactly the UN declaration work that June was talking about, but I think it's really important to acknowledge some of the roadmaps that exist. So for example, read the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. If you read it in its totality, you'll understand child welfare, education, culture, language, missing women, media. There's themes there. Understanding those tools, and then find a way to latch on to something that brings you passion. Do you see what I mean? I think sometimes we make the mistake of trying to recreate the wheel instead of honoring the work that has already been done, and then to breathe life into those calls to action. That's why it's an invitation for us to make it a call to action. So that would be my piece. And I'm always learning. I'm trying to learn about my own culture and reclaim that. And so I'm always open. If someone gave me an invitation to say, Melanie, you should read this roadmap for whatever community, I would be honored to do that. I'd almost be ashamed to ask for it though, because that cultural humility, some of us are hard to kind of confront what we don't know, because it exposes our ignorance.
Thank you. That is really, and I think that really kind of echoes what June was saying too, that when we're reinventing, we can actually also find alternative frameworks that we can draw from, right? June was talking about Jamaica, and you were talking about the UN Declaration, that we sometimes don't, think of that we have to tear everything down and start all over, but there are actually existing, especially resistant models that we can draw on. So that is a wonderful piece of advice that I'll take to the next, I don't know, like administrators meeting.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Minister Mark, and just thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we'll welcome you back to SFU another time.
Fantastic. Good night, everyone. Be safe.
So I want to thank all the speakers and also, Patsy, June, everybody and all of you for participating in tonight's really inspiring event. Now, if you would like to support us in continuing Rosemary's legacy, as well as if you feel inspired tonight and want to see more every year, we would really appreciate your donations. So you can see the link on the chat, and please give generously. To conclude the event, I would like to just announce the two prize winners. The first prize is a $150 SFU bookstore prize, and it goes to Michelle Danda. The second prize is a SFU swag prize, which is worth $50, and it goes to Muriel Perry. Very congrats to the winners, and you will be contacted by the SFU Alumni Office with details on how to collect your prize. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you so much, and I hope to see some of you again in other events.